Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole crew styling when we step out of the car. Bouncers lift the rope and the crowd goes off. 20 shots to the table, we don't even hit the bar.
Happy holidays. Want to welcome back our audience and listeners here to the Florida International University Ratcliffe Art and Design Incubator collaboration with Inspicio Arts, now in its 12th edition, right? Ray, is this number 12 or number 11?
We're doing 14 actually.
Oh, okay.
14's number 14 is gonna come out this month.
Time flies when you're having fun. And I switched backgrounds today. I'm in my living room with this wonderful, beautiful tree that I had to decorate myself because nobody here wanted to help me. So it took me a couple of days, Ray. So what do you think?
Oh, I think it's beautiful. I was gonna ask
Thank
you,
you.
did the whole family decorate the
No.
tree? But now I'm really sad to hear you had to do it yourself.
This one is handmade by my oldest son. There's a couple of them that are arts and crafts from when they were, in school, which is fun to hang up because now
Of course.
one's a teenager and the other one's almost 20 years old. So, So Ray, let's kick it off because we have, I love to hear some of these stories mostly when they are related to our community. And I want to kick it off with Aurin Squire. Did I say it right? Aurin?
Yes.
Journalist, screenwriter, and playwright who grew right here, in Opelika, in our backyard, graduated from Northwestern, the Actor Studio, and Juilliard. Those are pretty big names. And has written the book for the new musical, A Wonderful World. Obviously, for those that know, it's the life story of jazz legend Louis Armstrong. And this comes, it kind of takes place through the eyes of these 4 different women in his life. And it's premiering at the Colony Theater on Lincoln Road this month. So tell me, Ray, what takeaways do we have of his journey? Because they're quite interesting. I know you asked him quite a few questions on the interviews that are on Inspicio, but I think one of the ones that caught my attention first was that, nowadays arts and music classes are not very, they're not offered as much as they used to. And he talks about that, how that kind of influenced, his background. And also early on in high school, at least 2 teachers said, you're a writer. So kind of let's start with that first chapter.
Well, I think the remarkable thing about Aurin, who I only met to do this interview, is, although I want to meet him a lot more now, is that he's like an open receptor for what the universe is sending him his way. And later on in the interview, he talks about the importance of serendipity, meaning all the different things that steered him in different directions throughout his career. But in order for serendipity to happen, you have to be a good listener and you have to hear and see the breadcrumbs that the universe is throwing your way and say, oh, that looks interesting. Let me explore that. So I think that goes all the way back to when he was a child. And one of the interesting things he said, and I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say this before, was that he spent a lot of time driving around with his father, who listened to books on tape. And so as a 6-year-old, he's listening to books like The Great Gatsby, to Herzog by Saul Bellow, which is, pretty tough to understand as an adult, let alone a kid, and to The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he loved them all, things like that. And I think, maybe the analogy here is that when we see kids being exposed to more than one language when they're really young, they sort of naturally pick it up. Like my granddaughter is 3 years old and her mother speaks French. And so she's already bilingual, speaking French and English, and she just goes back and forth, between them. And maybe the same thing could be said for exposure to literature and to a love of writing and to a love of words, because, Aurin was driving around listening to that with his dad. And he said his dad never picked a book and said, what do you want to read? He just put on the books that he wanted to hear. And, they were great classic books. So I think that's, and I think you're also pointing out that back when he was in school, that there was more arts education. The funding for arts education hadn't diminished. The concept of teaching to the test didn't exist yet. He went to school before that. And so just to make another leap here, when I interviewed Alberto Carvalho, the superintendent of schools from Miami-Dade County, and I asked him about funding for the arts, he said, education without arts education is malpractice. And that's because you don't have to necessarily have talent to become an artist or writer or painter or whatever it is, or musician. But to be exposed to it means you're exposed to a world that expands your horizons, that expands your vision. And you're not just limited to the neighborhood you grew up in. You're all of a sudden got the world as your source of information.
So, I think you and I talked before we start, recording our little previews. Louis Armstrong, this particular story is from the point of view of 4 different women, right? I think you asked him, where did this come from? He didn't take credit for it. He spoke about it being part of a bar talk and just a discussion of, how do we tell this story? What takeaway do we have from that? Because these are 4 very different women.
Well, first of all, let's go back to the serendipity part. He tells a story, one of the videos, number 16 on the list. If you've seen our videos, we present them instead of one long video, they're broken up into multiple clips. And it might be anywhere from 10 to 25 video clips. Each one is 1 question, 1 answer. And I asked him a question about the role of serendipity in his career. And he went on a 15-minute, as he called it, rant about serendipity. And in this case, the serendipity was that he was invited to a Christmas party. This is a good time of year to be telling this story. He was invited to a Christmas party, and unbeknownst to him, it was a secret Santa Christmas party, and everybody's giving each other presents, and he didn't know about it. He didn't show up with a present. So somebody said, oh, here, you can have this present. And when he unwrapped it, it was a biography of Louis Armstrong. So here's the serendipity that before he ever thought about doing this play, he was given the biography of Louis Armstrong, and that became the source of this story. And in talking with not only Aurin, but with the, I've interviewed the key cast members, Jusan Williams, who plays Louis Armstrong, plus the people who play the 4 wives. And obviously there was a much more known about Louis Armstrong because he was a world famous person. There's not as much known as about the wives, especially the earlier women in his life. So the first person is Daisy Parker, who was a prostitute in Storyville, and she had a big influence on his life. And so for the women to do research to find out what these characters were like, of course, there weren't any videos of them or movies of them so that you would hear them talking and get a sense of the sound of your voice. So they had to kind of construct personas and make up little elements of their histories that they could fashion into characters for the stage play. At the same time, one of the great things about the play is that each of the women is incredibly distinctive from the other. You don't blend them together and forget who's who. It's very clear. And that's why telling the story of a jazz legend's life through 4 distinctive women is such a great way to get at the story. And that's what Aurin created. And when I interviewed the cast members, they talked about what a thrill it was to be, acting the dialogue that Aurin created.
So, you know, this is kind of like a timely release. You know, it's playing at the Colony Theater through this month. What kind of conclusion do we have about not only the play, but also, you know, Aurin himself? What is kind of the lesson there besides, I know you love having touched upon the serendipity part of it.
Well, there's two elements to what you were asking. So one is the play itself, and one is Aurin. I mean, Aurin is a multifaceted person. He's a journalist. He's a screenwriter for movies and television, and he's a playwright. So he's got a lot on his plate. He's got a lot going on. And in that serendipity section, he talks about these kind of stream of things that happen that just lead him in one direction or another that weren't planned. But also, this is a unique moment in time to be presenting a story from Black history, because we've been, especially non-African Americans, have been exposed to our awareness of the suppression of African American history in American history books and how much we didn't learn. So the example I always give is that when Trump tried to hold a rally in Tulsa a few years ago, and it turned out to be the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, and so everybody, or the African Americans, objected to the desecration of that anniversary. Most of us said, Tulsa massacre? Whoever heard of that? And when I talk with my African American friends, they said, oh, you want to know what else you never heard of? And they can rattle off lists of horrible things that happened throughout history that they were aware of, that I wasn't aware of as a reasonably awake person. And it's because it wasn't taught in, you know, unless you were studying history, you might have learned it if you did that in college, but certainly through high school, it wasn't part of the regular curriculum. So the fact that we're telling Louis Armstrong's story through a unique lens, through the eyes of the four wives, is right away twisting the history in a way and seeing it through the eyes of women, when most of history is written through the eyes of men. So it's great to have that 180 in a perspective, but also, you know, I grew up, I'm old enough to have grown up when Louis Armstrong was regarded, when anybody talked about him, he was the greatest jazz trumpeter. And he was kind of put forth as the person that would appear in movies to make them hipper, you know, kind of white movies like the Philadelphia Story, for example, which became a musical called High Society. And it had Frank Sinatra and Louis Armstrong and Bing Crosby and Princess Grace, before she was a princess. And so in all these movies, Louis Armstrong had a persona that they were projecting as this kind of hip guy who hung out with a lot of white people. And whether or not he was the greatest jazz trumpeter of his era, that was the kind of label that was put on him. And in this play and in the script that Aurin wrote, it humanizes him and takes Louis Armstrong beyond the frame of Hollywood. And so I think that was a particularly great accomplishment. My wife and I saw the play, the last play before they were supposed to open in March 2020. And then the next week it was shut down by the pandemic. So they've waited all this time to start it up again. But when we saw it, it was terrific. And we thought, oh, this is certainly going to go to Broadway. And I think that's still true.
Well, Ray Alman, as always, a pleasure connecting with you. I don't know, is this our last Inspicio before we sign off, or are we doing another one?
Good question. Well, we can talk about it. One thing I'm going to publish this week or next week is the interviews I did with the cast members of
Okay.
A Wonderful World. So with the 4 women and the lead Jusan Williams as Louis Armstrong. So
Mhm.
we can decide whether we want to talk about that or not. But if we don't, then I'll see you in 2022.
So happy holidays, Ray Elman, and to our audience and listeners here through these, I guess these last few months in this collaboration, right? Between the Radcliffe and Inspicio.
So long.
Bye, Ray.
See you next year. Bye-bye.
Next year. Happy New Year.
Same to you.